Tucked away in the rolling hills of Wyoming, Brookside seems like a place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. The streets are quiet, the houses are neat, and the residents go about their daily business. But behind this idyllic facade lie secrets that can shake even the most resilient person. One of these houses is home to David and Elizabeth Wilson, along with David's mother, Maria. Elizabeth, who recently moved to Brookside, is struggling to find her place in the new town. Maria, a former psychologist, has given them shelter. At first glance, they seem like a normal, happy family. However, Elizabeth and Maria share a secret that would shock their loved ones. What began as mutual help and support, their relationship gradually evolved into something more, a secret sexual affair. These encounters take place against the backdrop of ordinary days full of household chores and family dinners, making their double life even more risky. David, busy with his work as an engineer, does not notice the change in the behavior of his wife and mother. He trusts them both, unaware of the hidden drama unfolding right under his nose. But how long can you hide the truth in a small town where every rumor spreads like the wind? Neighbors begin to notice Elizabeth and Maria's unusual trips, their long walks, and their whispers in the kitchen when they think no one is listening. Curiosity grows, and soon this curiosity may lead to exposure. Under the warm Wyoming spring sun, life continues as usual in the small town of Brookside. Elizabeth and Maria embrace the new season and find new ways to spend time together, exploring the surrounding parks and green fields away from prying eyes. They often go away for the day, leaving David to mind his own business, unaware of their secret life. On one of these trips, they stopped at an abandoned mill, surrounded by spreading trees, where they could be seen without fear. Elizabeth, always more reserved and sensible, opened up more and more to Maria each time, finding the comfort and understanding that she had so lacked in her marriage with David. Maria, in turn, felt a growing power over Elizabeth, using her skills as a psychologist to deepen their connection. She carefully chose the words and places for their meetings, creating the illusion of safety and isolation from the outside world. At this time, David, having begun to notice some oddities in the behavior of his wife and mother, decides to spy on them a little to make sure of their well-being. He begins to suspect that the changes in Elizabeth's daily routine may hide something more than just a desire to spend time alone with nature. One day, returning early from work, David finds neither Elizabeth nor Maria at home. He decides to take advantage of this moment to check some suspicions. After fruitlessly searching for any clues in the house, he accidentally finds Elizabeth's notebook, where a piece of paper with the address of the old mill is sandwiched between the pages. With this information, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, David sets off to the indicated place, hoping to understand what is happening. As he approaches the mill, he hears voices, and his steps become more cautious and quiet. Near the old building, he sees Elizabeth and Maria. They embrace. David stops, his heart beating in unison with the spring wind blowing through the tree branches. Summer in Brookside comes suddenly, and so does David's realization that his world will never be the same. After witnessing what happened between his wife and mother, his life seemed to stop for a few moments. He couldn't accept what he saw, couldn't explain what he was witnessing. All his ideas about marriage, love, and trust were shattered. Returning home after his discovery at the old mill, David sat in the kitchen for a long time in absolute silence. He did not know how to approach the conversation with Elizabeth and Maria, did not know what to do with the pain and rage that was seething inside him. Every sound in the house, every movement seemed unnecessary and false to him. This house was no longer a place of peace and comfort. It had become a cage filled with betrayal. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Maria, unsuspecting, continue to live their secret life. They continue their trips and meetings, carefully hiding the traces of their relationship. However, the tension between them also gradually increases. Elizabeth, despite her affection for Maria, begins to feel guilty for betraying her husband. She becomes increasingly immersed in thoughts about where this relationship is leading and what will happen next. Maria, on the other hand, enjoys her control over the situation. She feels confident that she is in control, that no one will ever know their secret. She continues to convince Elizabeth that they can continue as they are, that no one should know the truth. But deep down, she begins to notice that Elizabeth is becoming more withdrawn and nervous. David, for his part, can no longer remain indifferent to what is happening around him. He realizes that by continuing to pretend, he is only delaying the inevitable. He needs to do something to regain control of his life, but he doesn't know how to approach the matter. He begins to remember moments when he suspected that something was wrong. Strange glances between his wife and mother, their long walks, whispered conversations. All these small details add up to one eerie picture. One hot summer day, when Elizabeth and Maria are away from home again, David decides to take action. He feels that he can no longer tolerate this deception, but he is not ready for an open conflict. Instead, he begins to plan a more cunning move. He decides to install hidden cameras in the house to record what is happening between Elizabeth and Maria. He is convinced that if he has evidence, he will be able to confront them both without any doubts. With the cameras strategically placed, David experiences an agonizing wait. He doesn't know what to expect, but his mind is already preparing him for the worst. He feels like a traitor for spying on people he once loved, but at the same time, he is convinced that he is doing it for the sake of justice. When Elizabeth and Maria return home, nothing foreshadows trouble. They behave as usual. Maria goes to her room, and Elizabeth begins to cook dinner for the whole family. David, trying to hide his tension, sits down in the living room overlooking the kitchen, pretending to read the newspaper. Every step they take now feels like a blow to the heart. He knows that soon his plan will work, and he will learn the whole truth. Meanwhile, Elizabeth begins to sense an unusual tension in the house. David seems distant. His silence seems ominous to her. She tries to speak to him, but he answers in short, dry sentences, avoiding her gaze. This silence becomes unbearable for her, and eventually she goes to bed, leaving him in the living room. Night falls, and David is left alone, lost in his thoughts and emotions. Tomorrow he will wake up a different person. It's morning. The summer sun has barely risen above the horizon when David, struggling with his inner conflict, decides to check the footage from the cameras he installed last night. His hands shake as he starts the video on his laptop. He hesitates for a long time, afraid of what he will see. But there is no turning back. The footage shows scenes of everyday life at home, conversations in the kitchen, casual encounters in the hallway. But the longer he watches, the more bizarre moments become apparent. Touches that linger too long, quiet whispers, fleeting glances that can no longer be interpreted as innocent. Then the camera captures what David was so afraid to see. He watches Elizabeth and Maria, confident that no one is watching, hugging and kissing in the living room. David's chest tightens. He can't believe his eyes, but the reality is right there. His wife and his mother, the women he's trusted his entire life, have been living double lives behind his back. He feels the world crumbling around him. His heart beats dull and heavy. Thoughts race through his head. How could they? How long has this been going on? Why them? David closes his laptop with rage and despair. He can no longer sit in inaction. His soul is consumed by anger mixed with a sense of betrayal. He ponders for a long time what to do next, but every decision seems senseless and useless. He knows one thing: this deception must be exposed. For several days, David walks around in a daze. Elizabeth and Maria continue their routine lives, unaware that David knows the truth. They act as they always do, with family warmth, cooking, spending time together, as if nothing is happening. But inside David, a determination is growing to end this lie. One evening, when Maria goes to her room early, Elizabeth is left in the kitchen, clearing away the dinner dishes. David enters the room, his steps heavy, his eyes full of inner pain. Elizabeth, sensing his presence, turns to him. But before she can say a word, she sees his face. His gaze is cold, full of hidden emotions. He doesn't say anything more. Instead, he takes out his laptop and turns on the camera feed. Elizabeth, stunned, can't hide her shock. She sees herself and Maria on the screen, their secret relationship captured on video. Her hands drop, her face goes pale. She knows it's all over now. David is silent. He doesn't want to shout or cause a scene. His strength in this moment was that he was no longer trying to pretend. Elizabeth tries to find the words to explain, but at this moment they seem empty. Every word she says is just an attempt to justify the inevitable. How long has this been going on? David finally asks. His voice is surprisingly quiet, but there is hidden pain in it. Elizabeth cannot answer right away. She stands before him, helpless and exposed, unable to find an excuse or an explanation. All she can do is remain silent. Finally, she whispers, "I don't know what to say." Her words hang in the air, but they bring no relief. David slowly turns away and leaves the room. He feels that this conversation will not change anything. Now, it is all up to him. What to do next, how to live with this truth, and what will happen to their marriage. He needs time to realize that his life will never be the same again. After the revelation, everything in the Wilson house changed. The atmosphere became tense and oppressive. The silence that had once brought peace now weighed on everyone in the house. Every step, every glance was accompanied by invisible but tangible barriers. The house, once filled with warmth and comfort, turned into a cold battlefield where everyone was forced to fight their own demons. David, shocked and devastated, becomes increasingly withdrawn. He avoids any conversation with Elizabeth and Maria, preferring to spend time alone. His workdays become longer, his evenings more torturous. He spends hours in the garage, fixing and dismantling old things, rather than face those who have so cruelly betrayed his trust. Elizabeth feels this alienation and confusion. She knows that their marriage is hanging by a thread, but she doesn't know how to bring it back. She is afraid that any word she says will only make the situation worse. One evening, she finally gets up the courage to talk to David. When she finds him in the garage, he is sitting at a table surrounded by tools, pretending to be busy fixing an old radio. His hands are working, but his mind is clearly far from here. Elizabeth sits quietly across from him and tries to start a conversation. "David, I'm sorry," she whispers, her voice shaking. "I don't know what to say, but I want to try to make things right." David doesn't look up, continuing to work on the radio parts. Several minutes of silence pass between them until he finally puts his tools down and looks at her. "Fix it?" His voice is cold and distant. "How are you going to fix it, Elizabeth? Take back what you did?" Her face turns even paler. She knows this conversation won't be easy, but she needs to do something to save their marriage. I was confused. Maria, she was manipulating me and I just didn't know how to stop it," Elizabeth continues, her voice breaking with emotion. "You didn't know how to stop?" David grins, but there's no humor in his eyes. "You could have stopped at any time, Elizabeth. You could have said no, but you didn't. You chose to betray me, and now you want to fix it?" Elizabeth doesn't know what to say. She feels like everything is crumbling around her. The words that seem so important in her head lose all meaning when they collide with the cold reality of their situation. She doesn't know how to convince David that her regrets are sincere. Meanwhile, Maria, aware that her secret has been revealed, tries to maintain the appearance of control, but anxiety is growing inside her. She knows that her influence over Elizabeth and David is now shaken, and this could lead to unpredictable consequences. Maria tries to talk to David, but he clearly avoids any meetings with her. He cannot forgive his mother for what she did, and every time he sees her, he feels growing disgust. One evening, when Maria tries to talk to him, David loses his temper and explodes. Their conversation turns into a heated argument, where accumulated grievances burst out. "How could you do this to us, to our family?" he screams, looking at Maria with anger. "You were always an example to me, and now I can't even look at you without disgust." Maria tries to justify herself, but her words ring hollow. She realizes that she is no longer in control of the situation. David is no longer the dutiful son who always trusted her advice. Now he sees her for who she really is, the woman who destroyed their family for her own selfish desires. Elizabeth overhears this argument, and although she feels guilty, understands that this conflict is inevitable. She watches their relationship deteriorate before her eyes and realizes that things have gone too far. At this point, the tension in the house reaches its peak. Everyone is involved in this tangled web of lies and betrayal, and every step can lead to disaster. David can no longer live in this house, where every corner reminds him of betrayal. He decides to leave the house and go away for a few days to sort out his thoughts and decide what to do next. When he leaves, Elizabeth and Maria are left alone, and an oppressive silence falls between them. They both now realize that their secret has destroyed not only their relationship with David, but everything they had. Several days had passed since David had left the house, leaving Elizabeth and Maria alone with their crumbling lives. The silence in the Wilson house had become even more oppressive, turning every room into a reminder of betrayal and pain. The charming facade of the perfect family had disappeared without a trace, and now only tension and uncertainty hung in the air. Maria began to realize that her manipulations had gone too far, and that she was no longer in control. She realized that her power over Elizabeth had weakened, and that her son David might never forgive her again. She constantly tormented herself with thoughts of how to regain her former peace, but all this now seems unattainable. Elizabeth, in a state of deep guilt and despair, avoids meeting Maria. Their once passionate and secret relationship has now become a source of horror and disgust. Elizabeth can no longer look at Maria the same way, because now everything they had has turned into destruction not only of their lives, but also of the life of David, whom she once loved. She begins to see Maria not only as a temptress, but also as the source of all her troubles. Maria, in an attempt to reconnect, insists on talking to Elizabeth. One evening, as darkness falls over Brookside and the house falls into a tense silence, Maria enters Elizabeth's room, intending to discuss the future. But Elizabeth, lost in her own tormented thoughts, has already decided that she does not want to continue the relationship. "We need to talk," Maria begins, her voice quiet but firm. She sits down across from Elizabeth, trying to meet her eyes. "You know we have no choice but to talk and sort this out." Elizabeth doesn't look at her. Her gaze is directed at nothing. Memories of the days when it all began swirl in her head. She feels her life spiraling out of control, captive to Maria's manipulations. But today, she is no longer the weak woman who is ready to submit. There is a rage brewing in her soul that has been suppressed for too long. "You should have stopped this sooner," Elizabeth finally says, her voice quiet but filled with pain and anger. "You manipulated me. You knew what you were doing, and now everything is ruined. My life, my marriage, everything." Maria knows this conversation will be a turning point. She tries to find the right words, but every argument she makes is met with Elizabeth's cold, condemning gaze. "You think it's that simple?" Maria raises her voice, losing control of herself. "I loved you, and you knew it. It wasn't manipulation, it was real." "Real?" Elizabeth stands up from her chair, her eyes burning with fury. "It was a lie. You destroyed my marriage, my life, and all for what? For your selfish passion? I can't take it anymore." Maria takes a step towards her, trying to calm her down, but Elizabeth pulls away. The tension in the room reaches its peak. Maria tries to hug her, but Elizabeth pushes her away in anger, causing Maria to trip and fall. Elizabeth, seeing Maria hit the edge of the dresser and remain motionless on the floor, froze for a moment. Time seemed to stand still. Maria's eyes were closed and blood was slowly starting to ooze from the wound on her head. Elizabeth panicked. Her entire world, which had been slowly collapsing until that moment, had now collapsed into chaos. She runs to Maria, shakes her, screams, trying to understand what happened, but there is no answer. She understands that this is the end. Everything in the room becomes unbearably quiet, as if the air itself froze, frightened by the horror of what is happening. Elizabeth is in shock. She doesn't know what to do next. Her mind is filled with the horror of what happened. It wasn't intentional, but now her life is changed forever. She sits next to Maria's body, unable to move, as if this moment has frozen her in a reality that no longer makes sense. Meanwhile, David, back in town after a few days away, feels a heavy atmosphere as he approaches the house. He opens the door, expecting the usual silence, but finds no one there. There is a strange tension in the house. He slowly climbs the stairs and hears faint sobbing. When he enters the bedroom, he sees Elizabeth sitting on the floor next to her mother's body. His eyes widen in shock. He can't believe what he sees in front of him. Mary is dead, and Elizabeth is sitting next to her, her hands and face covered in blood. David is silent. This moment is the culmination of everything they have experienced in the last months. There are no questions now, no answers. Only the horror and tragedy that has filled their lives. The silence that fell over the Wilson house seemed endless. David stood in the doorway of his bedroom, unable to take his eyes off the scene before him. His mother lay lifeless and bleeding on the floor, and his wife sat next to him, her head in her hands, her body racked with sobs. Time stood still, and for him the world had shrunk to this room, to this tragedy he could not comprehend. David took a few steps forward, his breathing quick and ragged. He knelt down next to Maria's body, touching her hand, trying to see if there was any hope. But her skin was cold, her eyes were closed, and it was clear. Maria was dead. Elizabeth, noticing the movement, looked up. There was horror in her eyes, mixed with a deep sense of guilt. She looked at David, trying to speak, but the words were stuck in her throat. Her lips trembled, and all attempts to explain were in vain. "It was an accident," she whispered, barely audible. Her voice was weak, as if she were speaking not to him but to herself, trying to justify what had happened. "I didn't mean to." David sat in silence. The events of the last few months flashed through his mind, the betrayal he had discovered, the bitterness that had settled in his heart, and now this, his mother's death. He didn't know how to react, his emotions a blur of pain and rage. Several agonizing minutes passed before he found the strength to stand. He pulled away from Maria's body, slowly walked away from Elizabeth, and walked to the phone to call the police. All that was left of their life was now a grim reality, where there was no more love, no more trust, only death and crime. Elizabeth, seeing David silently dialing the number, rose from the floor trying to stop him. Her hands were still covered in blood, her face a picture of pure horror. "No, David, please don't call. It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to end like this." She grabbed his hand, begging. But David, as if turned to stone, looked at her coldly, his eyes full of pain, but also determination. He could not forgive her, or himself. He knew that the truth had to come out, and no matter what he felt for Elizabeth, he could not close his eyes to what had happened. "I can't live with this anymore," he said quietly but firmly. "It has to end. All of it." The police arrived quickly. The officers entered the house, and immediately the space was filled with sounds. Radios, footsteps in the hallways, questions that seemed too loud in the silence. Elizabeth was arrested on the spot. Her hands, still stained with blood, were cuffed, and her face was pale and blank, as if she had resigned herself to her fate. David stood back, watching, but he no longer felt anything. He was devastated. Everything that had once mattered had been shattered overnight. He had lost both his mother and his wife, the two people closest to him, to their secret, destructive relationship. The life he knew was gone forever. The inquest into Maria's death was short, as it quickly became clear that it was a tragic accident. Elizabeth had not planned the murder, but her guilt before the law remained. She was sentenced to several years in prison for manslaughter, but this did not change the fact that her life had been destroyed just like David's. A few months later, David sold the house and moved away from Brookside. The small town that had once seemed so peaceful and perfect had become a symbol of pain and loss. He wanted to start a new life, away from the memories that haunted him at every turn. Elizabeth, serving her time in prison, no longer wrote or called David. She understood that their story was over, that she did not deserve forgiveness. All her dreams, her marriage, and her connection with Maria, all this turned into a tragedy that nothing could change.